Welcome to Essential Libertarianism, selected readings from Voluntaryist.com. Essential Libertarianism is voluntarism. Let's reclaim the anti-political heritage of this philosophy together. The essays and books we read in this show will bring us closer to the state-free voluntary society that we desire. Let's begin the journey.
Article number 4, A Voluntaryist Bibliography Annotated by Carl Wagner. General introduction and purpose of this bibliography. The Voluntarists are a newly formed group of libertarians who have organized to promote non-political strategies to achieve a free society. We have chosen to label ourselves voluntarists because the term libertarian has become too closely associated with the Libertarian Party. We believe that all efforts to elect libertarians to political office conflict with libertarian principles and that such efforts are strategically unsound. Engaging in political action, running candidates for office, and encouraging people to vote must inevitably sabotage the voluntarist goal of delegitimizing the state. The only long-range and lasting way to curtail state power is to dissolve the illusion of legitimacy which all states must have in order to sustain themselves. Libertarians must come to act consistently with the voluntarist insight that all state power ultimately depends on the sanction and cooperation of its victims. The voluntarist insight. The voluntarist insight that all state power is grounded on general popular acceptance was first formulated by Etienne de la Boétie, 1530 to 1563. In his discourse on voluntary servitude, which was probably written during the 1550s, la Boétie discussed one of the most critical problems of political philosophy, namely the question of civil disobedience. Quote, "Why in the world do people consent to their own enslavement?" he asked. Quote, "Why do the bulk of the people acquiesce in their own subjection?" End quote. La Boétie answered these questions by explaining the governmental mystique created by the rulers and their intellectual apologists. By relying on custom, by providing both bread and circuses to the citizenry, and by creating a vast network of governmental supporters dependent on political plunder, governments were able to engineer and sustain their own popular acceptance among the populace. La Boétie was also the first political philosopher to move from an emphasis on the importance of consent to the strategic question of toppling tyranny by leading the public to withdraw their consent. He saw that violence was not necessary. Quote, "Obviously there is no need of fighting to overcome the tyrant, for he is automatically defeated if the country refuses to consent to its own enslavement. It is not necessary to deprive him of anything, but simply to give him nothing. It is therefore the inhabitants themselves who permit, or rather bring about, their own subjection, since by ceasing to submit, they would put an end to their servitude." End quote. Realizing the great value of natural liberty, La Boétie called for a thorough process of educating the public to the truth, a process which would give back to the people a knowledge of the myths and illusions fostered by the state. The primary tasks of the opponents of state power is therefore an educational one, to alert the public to their despotic condition, and then to demystify and desanctify the entire state apparatus. There are 2 English-language editions of La Boétie's essay readily available. The best, and the one quoted from above, was prepared by Free Life Editions of New York in 1975 with the title of The Politics of Obedience, the Discourse of Voluntary Servitude. Despite his advocacy of libertarian political activity, Murray Rothbard's introduction to this edition, The Political Thought of Etienne de la Boétie, gives a great deal of support to the voluntarist critique of political action. Political activity not only unnecessarily reinforces the image of state legitimacy, which, as La Boétie pointed out, we must destroy, but it is also unlikely to end state power. La Boétie's analysis implies that educational activities and nonviolent resistance to the state, such as occurred in India during the Gandhian campaigns against the British, are sufficient to topple states. The other edition of the discourse was prepared by William Flygare and is accompanied by a preface from James Barton. It is titled The Will to Bondage. Included is the original French version of the essay, alongside the first English translation, which was prepared in 1735. The Free Life edition carries a 1942 translation, so it's worthwhile to compare the two. There is not a great deal of secondary material concerning La Boétie and his discourse in English. The 2 best general discussions have been prepared by Nonerl O. Coahane and James Brown Scott. Scott includes a chapter entitled La Contre un de la Boétie, Tyrannicide Through the Ages, in his The Catholic Conception of International Law. La Boétie's essay is treated as part of the historical tradition of tyrannicide. Scott refers to it as, quote, a literary exercise in behalf of liberty in which he condemns tyranny in any and all of its forms as ruinous alike to the tyrant, the state, and the people, end quote. He aptly summarizes Laboisi's position. Quote, he does not require of the people that they shall violently overthrow the tyrant, but merely that they shall cease to support him, whereupon he will fall of his own dead weight, end quote. Keohane's discussion of La Boétie originally appeared as the radical humanism of Etienne de la Boétie, and then was condensed for his book Philosophy and the State in France, the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, as On Voluntary Servitude, La Boétie. Keohane places La Boétie in the historical perspective of 16th century France by pointing out that La Boétie was both a lawyer and member of Parliament. Despite his place in the state apparatus, Keohane regards La Boétie's premises as basically anarchistic, because they lead to the conclusion that no man or group of men should have authority over other individuals. In his newly published The Ethics of Liberty, Murray Rothbard devotes some space to the voluntarist insight in his chapter on the nature of the state. The latter half of this chapter deals explicitly with La Boétie and generally discusses the significance of state legitimacy. Rothbard shows how the state has historically aligned itself with the church, and that when this became no longer possible, how the state assumed control over public education. The state is thus able to, quote, mold the minds of its subjects, end quote, from kindergarten to graduate school in order to foster this voluntary servitude. In a footnote, Rothbard cites two other disparate thinkers who have understood the importance of majority consent to governmental tyranny. He quotes from David Hume's essay on the first principles of government. Hume, who was no libertarian, wrote, quote, nothing appears more surprising than the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and the implicit submission with which man resigns their own sentiments to those of their rulers. We shall find that, as force is always on the side of the governors have nothing to support them but opinion. It is therefore on opinion only the government is founded. Rothbard also cites Ludwig von Mises in Human Action. Voluntarism from a historical perspective. The voluntarist insight and the general non-political approach to social change, which it suggests has a long-standing place in the libertarian tradition. For a general discussion, see Voluntarism in the Libertarian Tradition by Karl Wagner. Any late 19th century encyclopedia should have an entry under voluntarism, since the term originated back in the early 1820s, when it was used in the religious disputes between established churchmen in England and the dissenters. Typical of such articles is the one found in Chambers' Encyclopedia. During the 1830s and until the 1850s, the term voluntarism was applied to the advocates of private schools in England. These voluntary educationists saw a religious threat in state-controlled education, and many believed that the law of supply and demand, or the voluntary principle as they termed it, would provide for the education of the whole English people. Edward Meall, a well-known publisher and dissenter, wrote a book entitled Views of the Voluntary Principle, which characterized the meaning of voluntarism for mid-19th century England. Auberon Hébert attempted to repopularize the term voluntarism during the 1880s and 1890s in his voluntarist journal Free Life. Hébert was a supporter of voluntary taxation, and one of the last projects of his life was the preparation and publication of A Plea for Voluntarism, which appeared in the Voluntarist Creed. Both the plea and the principles of voluntarism in Free Life by an American supporter of Hébert have been reprinted in Eric Mack's collection The Right and Wrong of State Compulsion and Other Essays by Auberon Hébert. Another classical example of voluntarism at work in England is to be found in William Godwin's Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, which first appeared in 1793. The best introduction to Godwin is found in the 1946 reprint edition by F.E.L. Priestley. Godwin believed that physical force was too uncertain, and that peaceful resistance to tyrannical government was more desirable and effective. Godwin argued for reasonable discussion and disciplined non-cooperation as the means of fighting authority. In Book 2, Chapter 3, and Book 4, Chapter 1, he urged that, quote, all government is founded on opinion. Men at present live under any particular form because they conceive it in their interest to do so. Destroy this opinion, and the fabric which is built upon it falls to the ground. Make men wise, and by that very operation you make them free. Civil liberty follows as a consequence of this. No usurped power can stand against the artillery of opinion. Godwin, in one important particular, was at variance with the main tradition of dissent in the 18th century. A large body of dissenters thought in terms of politics. They tended to see problems as political and to seek political solutions. They favored associations and the normal methods of bringing political pressure to bear. They looked to legislative action for a solution of problems. Godwin, on the other hand, looked only to the reformation of the individual, objected to political parties, and had no faith in political solutions of what were for him simply moral problems. The voluntaristic dissenters believed that moral agitation was always more effective and more proper than political activity. The 19th century abolitionists, both in England and the United States, struggling to abolish slavery and the slave trade, were faced with similar problems. Was slaveholding to be abolished by moral suasion or political means? Should abolitionists participate in party politics, or should they hold aloof from such controversies? Should they create their own organizations to propagate the abolition of slavery? Should they use political action to achieve their goals? The problems faced by the 19th century abolitionists were very similar to the ones faced by 20th century libertarians in their struggle to achieve a free society. William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, and Henry Clark Wright were the leaders of the radical abolitionist movement in America. These men and their followers in the New England non-resistance society held that all office holding and voting was morally wrong and reprehensible. Ultimately, the Garrisonians came to see the Constitution as a document which supported slavery and one to which they could not swear personal allegiance. These abolitionists suggested many of the arguments used by anti-political libertarians today. For example, they raised the issue of personal integrity. How could any abolitionist, read libertarian, accept a government salary or swear a public oath of allegiance to the Constitution or uphold laws which violate personal liberty? Garrison argued that political parties alter one's fundamental outlook towards the state. The Liberty Party, which had been purposely formed as an anti-slavery party in 1840, appalled Garrison, both as a matter of theory and of tactics. He claimed that an anti-slavery party would split the movement and dilute anti-slavery principles by dragging them into the political gutter. The Garrisonian ideas were propagated in many forums. Garrison engaged in a debate with James Birney, soon to be head of the Liberty Party in the 1830s. In their A Letter to the Political Obligations of Abolitionists, Garrison argued that moral suasion, not political action, was needed to reform public sentiment. Both of Garrison's chief helpers, Phillips and Wright, independently expressed their anti-political views. Wright authored a small book entitled Ballot Box and Battlefield, which he claimed that the ballot box was only a makeshift substitute for the violence of bullets on the battlefield. Wright held that no man could honestly undertake to become a voter and then vote against the existence of government. Quote, "May a man consent to be invested with power to do an evil?" he asked. Wright claimed that a man may never rightfully consent to do what he thinks wrong. He who would do so proves himself dishonest. Quote, "He consents to be vested with power to do what he acknowledges to be wrong and swears to do it. Such a man is unworthy of any trust." End quote. Thus, Wright concluded the fact that any man, knowing the nature and duties of a congressman or president, quote, "will consent to hold these offices is of itself sufficient evidence that he is not a true and good man." End quote. Wright summarized his arguments by stating that he would not vote, even if by his one vote he could free all the slaves. Wendell Phillips considered the question, can an abolitionist vote or take office under the United States Constitution, and concluded quite straightforwardly that they could not. The secondary literature dealing with the abolitionist position on voting is quite extensive and certainly much easier to locate than some of the primary materials. Two standard discussions of the voting controversy can be found in Eileen Creditor, Means and Ends in American Abolitionism, and in Lewis Perry, Radical Abolitionism, Anarchy, and the Government of God in Anti-Slavery Thought. Another excellent discussion of the Garrisonian critique of politics can be found in William Weissach, The Sources of Anti-Slavery Constitutionalism in America. Some of Henry Clark Wright's writings, as well as excerpts from the Garrison-Birney Exchange, can be found in Truman Nelson's Documents of Upheaval, selections from William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, 1831 to 1865. Another very interesting aspect of the abolitionist movement is to be found in the writings of Henry David Thoreau and his close friend Charles Lane. Lane was an Englishman, attracted to this country through his friendship with Bronson Alcott, another close friend of Thoreau. Both Alcott and Lane were arrested for refusal to pay their town taxes, and their examples served to spur Thoreau onto his well-known example of tax resistance. All three were opposed to voting and made their views widely known. Lane wrote an extensive series of letters which appeared in Garrison's The Liberator in 1843. They were entitled A Voluntary Political Government and have been recently reprinted. In the letters, Lane advocated a totally voluntary, anarchistic society. Lane's aversion to politics is apparent in many of the letters, and he realized that governmental control rests on the acquiescence of the citizenry. Quote, "The mixture of education with politics," by which he meant public schooling, "is only a contrivance to gild the iron chains by which men are so despotically bound." End quote. In his third letter, Lane urged us to go as far as possible from human governments. Participation in politics is evil. Quote, "Like all of our enemies, state oppression will die of itself if we meddle not with it," end quote, and do not support it. Disown the government and do not support it with your taxes. Enlighten the oppressed as to their own self-imposed servitude, but stay away from the state, for it will only contaminate you. The similarity between Lane's answer and Thoreau's solution and Thoreau's own resistance to civil government is quite striking. Quote, "When the subject has refused allegiance and the officer has resigned his office, then the revolution is accomplished." End quote. Lysander Spooner, the famous individualist anarchist and constitutional lawyer, also played a prominent role in the abolitionist movement. Before he evolved into an outright anarchist, Spooner wrote some trenchant and logical attacks against the Garrisonian claim that the Constitution supported slavery. These are reprinted in the collected works of Lysander Spooner and appear as The Unconstitutionality of Slavery. Spooner's famous An Essay on Trial by Jury and his attacks on the fugitive slave law were all written to show why the common law, when uncorrupted by state legislation, upheld individual rights and destroyed slavery. There are some brilliant passages in all these works upholding natural rights and especially the rights of all citizens to resist unjust acts of oppression perpetrated by the government. After the Civil War, and as a result of having lived through a domestic rebellion in which all the ideas of the American Revolution were totally ignored, Spooner became an anarchist. In his No Treason series, Spooner showed that the U.S. government could not claim either voting or tax-paying as proof that individuals consented to the government. Neither were evidence of any single person's consent to the Constitution as a legal document. Spooner claimed that both paying taxes and voting were done under indirect threats, and therefore would be construed as acts of self-defense. However, Spooner never maintained that the people should vote, or that voting was proper, or that he personally would ever take part in the political process. Rather, he argued that when and if people vote, their actions were not to be interpreted as evidence that they actually supported the Constitution. Spooner eventually concluded that no one should have the right to vote or make laws. Quote, "No human being, nor any number of human beings, have any right to make laws, and compel other human beings to obey them. To say that they have is to say that they are masters and owners of those whom they require such obedience." End quote. Spooner's final conclusions on voting were expressed in his piece, Against Woman Suffrage, which was reprinted in Benjamin Tucker's Liberty, and in Rampart Individualist. Many other 19th century individualist anarchists supported Spooner's position against political involvement. Josiah Warren, for example, one of the earliest American anarchists, rejected politics and engaged in a lifelong quest for the development of anarchist communities. Benjamin Tucker, the student of both Warren and Spooner, and editor of the famous journal Liberty, compiled his views on anarchist methods in a section of his book titled Instead of a Book. The best of Tucker's anti-political views are presented in a short editorial called The Method of Anarchy. Tucker advocated passive resistance as the superior alternative to either ballots or violent revolution. Referring to the voluntarist insight, Tucker claimed that passive resistance, which hereafter shall be referred to as nonviolent resistance, was the most potent weapon ever wielded by man against oppression. Quote, "Power feeds on its spoils and dies when its victims refuse to be despoiled. They can't persuade it to death. They can't vote it to death. They can't shoot it to death, but they can always starve it to death. When a determined body of people, sufficiently strong in numbers and force of character to command respect and make it unsafe to imprison them, shall agree to quietly close their doors in the face of the tax collector, government will go by the board." End quote. Tucker cited the near success of the Irish Land League and No Rent movement in Ireland as examples of nonviolent resistance campaigns. Francis Tandy, a follower of Tucker, in his chapter on methods in voluntary socialism, reiterated the strength of Tucker's argument for nonviolent resistance. Quote, "To gain anything by political methods, it is first necessary to gain a majority of the votes cast, and even then you have to trust the integrity of the men elected to office. But with nonviolent resistance, this is unnecessary. A strong, determined, and intelligent minority, employing methods of nonviolent resistance, would be able to carry all before it." End quote. Tandy astutely pointed out the important relationships between means and ends in libertarian thought. Quote, "Nonviolent resistance can never pass a law. It can only nullify laws. Consequently, it can never be used as a means of coercion, and is particularly adapted to the attainment of anarchy. All other schools of reform propose to compel people to do something. For this, they must resort to force, usually by passing laws. These laws depend upon political action for their inauguration and physical violence for their enforcement. Anarchists are the only reformers who do not advocate physical violence. Tyranny must ever depend upon the weapon of tyranny, but freedom can be inaugurated only by means of freedom." End quote. Tandy realized that when nonviolent resistance is practiced, attention is drawn to its underlying principles. Quote, "Thus education and nonviolent resistance go hand in hand and help each other step by step towards the goal of human freedom." End quote. A good discussion of late 19th century individualist anarchist strategy will appear in the forthcoming Liberty Centennial volume in the chapter by Morgan Edwards, Neither Bombs Nor Ballots, Benjamin Tucker and the Strategy of Anarchism. During the first half of the 20th century, the few well-known libertarians actually followed the anti-political pattern set by Spooner, Tucker, and Tandy. Albert J. Knox's overall attitude certainly precluded political action. In his essay, What the American Votes For, which originally appeared in the American Mercury of February 1933, Knox claims that the only time he ever voted, he cast a write-in ballot for Jefferson Davis on the basis that, quote, "If we can't have a live statesman, let us by all means have a first-class corpse," end quote. In his essay, Anarchist's Progress, Knox points out why it is impossible for the best-intentioned office holder not to sell out to the system. Suppose that you put a Sunday school superintendent in charge of a whorehouse. Quote, "He might trim off some of the coarser fringes of the job and put things in a state of outward order and decency," end quote, "but he must run a whorehouse, or he would promptly hear from the owners." The voters elect politicians to administer the state, not to destroy it. In the final analysis, Knox thought that, quote, "Great and salutary social transformations, such as in the end, do not cost more than they come to, are not affected by political shifts, by movements, by programs and platforms, least of all by violent revolutions, but by sound and disinterested thinking," end quote. H.L. Mencken, despite his outward appearances as a newspaperman, had some rather acerbic thoughts on the political system. His book, Prejudices, 4th series, carries two implicitly anti-political essays, The Politician and On Government. Mencken begins his analysis of the politician by pointing out the assumption of the great majority of American voters, that politicians are divided into two classes, and that one of those classes is made up of good ones. Hence, the American public thinks that every time they turn one set of politicians out of office, they will get better ones in their place. But how wrong they are, as history has proved. Quote, "The primary error lies in making the false assumption that some politicians are better than others," end quote. Obviously, they are not. Quote, "Politics, as hopeful men practice it in the world, consist mainly of the delusion that a change in form is a change in substance," end quote. Frank Chodorov really got to the heart of the matter when he declared, quote, "that the state itself, regardless of its composition, is an exploitative institution," end quote. No matter who operates a whorehouse, to use Knox's metaphor, still operates a whorehouse, and any class of politician, even if they call themselves libertarians, are still politicians. It makes little difference whether libertarians, socialists, Democrats, or Republicans are in office. The state is still nothing more than a criminal gang. In his essays On Righting and Evil and If We Quit Voting, Chodorov advocated staying away from the polls. Quote, "Why should a self-respecting citizen endorse an institution grounded in thievery?" End quote. A voter's boycott, unlike other revolutions, but much like nonviolent resistance campaigns, quote, "calls for no organization, no violence, no war fund, and no leader to sell it out," end quote. Other more recent libertarians have similarly called for mass non-participation in the electoral process. Robert Lefebvre engaged in lengthy correspondence with a number of congressional representatives and senators during 1972 in an effort to determine the legitimacy of their participation in government. Drawing much on Spooner's analysis of elected representatives, Lefebvre demonstrates in his The Power of Congress that the theory of electoral representation has no firm basis. His correspondents could not agree, quote, "whether representatives should really be agents of their electors, and varied widely in their interpretation of their own function and authority," end quote. Lefebvre contends that because of the secret ballot and the structure of our political institutions, elected office holders are in fact representatives of no one. They had best all pack up and go home. Lian, in his None of the Above, the Lesser of Two Evils, is Evil, attacks majority rule as a violation of individual rights and opposes the political vote. Voting is wrong because it does not give individuals the right to express their true opinions about the politicians. The politicians do not dare insert none of the above on the ballot for fear that no politician would be elected to office. Robert Ringer, in his bestseller Restoring the American Dream, cites Lian favorably and makes some telling comments about the Libertarian Party and voting in general. Quote, "When you vote for a candidate, you're voting to put someone in a position to rule the lives of your fellow man. Men who either do not want that candidate to rule them or do not want anyone to rule them," end quote. He also said, quote, "The most disconcerting thing about the Libertarian Party is that it is a political party," end quote. Every political party and every politician is subject to the historical law of corruption. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Among the younger generation of contemporary libertarians, Samuel Edward Konkan III and George H. Smith have led the attack against political action. Konkan's magazine New Libertarian and his Movement of the Libertarian Left have long criticized the Libertarian Party. Quote, "He who serves the party serves the state," end quote, because it's impossible to destroy the system by joining it. Conklin's emphasis on counter-economics and agorism as alternatives to political strategies is set forth in his New Libertarian Manifesto. Smith, too, has tried to convey the message that politics and libertarianism are inconsistent. One of his earliest attacks on the Libertarian Party was a satirical victory speech of the Libertarian Party President-elect 1984, which appeared in Supplement 4 of New Libertarian Weekly. Smith tried to show why a libertarian president would be involved in all sorts of philosophical predicaments. How would he deal with tax evaders, drug smugglers, victims of victimless crime laws, etc.? This criticism was followed up by a seriously theoretical piece entitled Party Dialogue. His most recent foray against the LP occurred at the California LP Convention on board the Queen Elizabeth II in February of 1982. Here he continued his debate with Ant-Man under the title Political Action versus Non-Political Action, in which they exchanged their views on the validity of political action for libertarians. Smith's efforts against the LP have been instrumental in the formation of the Voluntarists, whose purpose is to spread the message that libertarianism must be propagated by non-political means. This brings to a conclusion our survey of literature which deals with the voluntarist insight and the question of anti-political and non-political activity. As can be seen from the suggestions of Tucker and Tandy, nonviolent resistance is a very useful tool for voluntarists to embrace. It is hopeful that the efforts put forth in this bibliographic essay will spark libertarians to at least investigate the merits and the demerits of nonviolent resistance, which itself has an extensive body of literature built up around it. The findings of such a study should be of great interest to all voluntarists, and we hope it is not long forthcoming.
Thank you for listening to Essential Libertarianism. You can check out the archives of all of our episodes at essentiallibertarianism.com. And you can subscribe to future episodes on any podcatcher, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, and more. This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.